Silence, please. All stand. This coroner's court is now.
Good morning. Yes, Ms.
Good morning,
Ward.
Your Honour. I appear today, along with Mr Castleton of Senior Counsel, in the concluding submissions for the Stockyard Flat Yarrowitch fire inquiry, the inquest into the death of Russell Bratby, and then the Palmerzoki fire at Upper Turon.
Thank you.
Could I have Your Honour's leave to again sit down to address the court today?
Of course.
Thank you.
And I'll just take appearances.
Your Honour, Woodland, I appear for the Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service, National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales.
Thank you.
May it please the court, my name is Ransom. I appear on behalf of IAG.
Thank you, Ms. Ransom. Thank you, Ms. Ward.
Thank you, Your Honour. Firstly, these are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the fire known as the Stockyard Flat Fire, Yarrowitch. These submissions will invite the court to find that the Stockyard Flat Fire ignited on 26 October 2019, although it was first seen and reported to authorities the next day on 27 October 2019. These submissions will also invite the court to find that the fire originated within the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park, most likely within steep and inaccessible terrain within the Yarrowitch Gorge. Page 42 of the brief will now be shown on the screen, which will assist Your Honour to recall the location of Stockyard Flat in proximity to the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park, and then the small hamlet of Yarrowitch just down to the southeast of where Stockyard Flat is marked on that map. Your Honour will also see from the map that this region falls within the Walker local government area in the Northern Tablelands of New South Wales, Walker sitting off to the west on that map, which is itself encompassed within the lands of the Dunghutti people. The fire inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act of 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and its area of origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. Your Honour, the Stockyard Creek fire claimed the life of Mr Russell Bratby. Mr Bratby's wife, Tracy, has assisted and participated through the course of the inquiry, the inquest into the death of her husband. I'm not sure whether Russell's family will be watching today or will take the opportunity to view the YouTube footage over the coming weeks and months. Mr Bratby was injured when the fire impacted upon his and neighbouring properties along Blomfield Road, Yarrowitch, on 7 November 2019. This came a week after the commencement of the Stockyard Creek fire and on a day when the fire took an extreme run towards the east-southeast. Once discovered, Mr Bratby received treatment on scene and was then conveyed to Port Macquarie Hospital, followed by the Royal North Shore Hospital, where he was pronounced life extinct on 29 December 2019. Whilst evidence in one hearing has been treated as evidence in the other, closing submissions will address the fire inquiry first and then the inquest separately, with those submissions to follow immediately on from this. It is well to remember that Stockyard Flat Fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Stockyard Flat Fire to proceed to further investigation via general inquiry. It is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the 2019-2020 bushfire season, and matters that might arise in relation to this fire, such as the nature and adequacy of warnings to residents in the fire's path, will be addressed at a systemic level in the course of other inquiries proceeding to a Stage 2 representative case study. The chronology that follows is drawn from the evidence the Court received within the Coronial Brief of Evidence, including statements from members of New South Wales Police, the Rural Fire Service, a New South Wales Police fire investigator, RFS operational documents, and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. The chronology also draws upon the oral evidence from the officer in charge of the fire inquiry, Senior Constable Michael McDonnell, and Detective Technical Inspector Michelle Hepburn, both of whom gave evidence on 16 March 2022. The evidence establishes that a significant dry storm cell passed through the Yarrowitch Valley on 26 October 2019 in the vicinity of the hamlet of Stockyard Flat. This is northwest of the village of Yarrowitch on the Oxley Highway, which connects Walker to the northwest over to Warhope in the east. Page 53 of the Coronial Brief is now being displayed on screen and records lightning strike data. In particular, from this map, 4 lightning strikes were recorded within the same second at 3:51 p.m. on 26 October 2019, all less than a kilometre from where the Stockyard Creek fire was initially mapped as having ignited the next day. The Stockyard Creek fire was first reported to authorities at about 3 p.m. on 27 October 2019 and was authorised as going at 3:40 that afternoon. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't permit a finding as to who the first witness to the fire was. In any event, the RFS were advised of a new fire in the area, and this led Chris Lute, the captain of the Yarrowitch RFS Brigade, and James Goodwin, the Rural Fire Service New England Zone Deputy Group Officer, to travel out and search for it. This was no easy task in the circumstances. They understood the fire was within proximity of the Yarrowitch Gorge, but according to Mr Goodwin, due to the smoke haze from the other fires to the northeast of Yarrowitch, the location of this fire took 4 hours to find. In this regard, it is important to step back and observe that there was at this time believed to be another fire burning closer to Walker. So pages 50 and 51 from the brief will now be displayed. And Your Honour can firstly see Stockyard Flat marked towards the middle of this fire, this map, but with the much larger Carrow Creek fire burning to the north, and then a smaller fire at Rowley's Gorge boundary, closer to Walker. We'll also be able to recognise, hopefully from the next map, the line scan showing fire in the general area, the proximity of the small fire in the Yarrowitch Gorge and its location to the larger Carrai fire to the north, and again to fires closer to Walker, including the Doyles River fire, which was burning nearby. Returning to the chronology, Mr Goodwin and Mr Lute ultimately travelled to a property along Blomfield Road known to offer a good vantage point of the country beyond. This is displayed in this document from page 100 of the Bratby Inquest Brief, which shows Blomfield Road and the various properties marked along it. It was the property of David Bomer that afforded the vantage point to Mr Goodwin and Mr Lute, and which will assume greater significance in the inquest into the death of Russell Bratby. Mr Goodwin and Mr Lute observed from the Bomar property a fire burning in very steep terrain to the northwest in the Yarrowitch Gorge. What we have displayed here, Your Honour, is a close-up view, again taken from the Bratby Inquest Brief, but it shows the the vantage point in the Beaumar property, which then looks down into the Yarrowitch Gorge. Clearly the photo has been taken long after the fire had moved through. The area where the fire was observed was so inaccessible even to the local RFS fire captain that firefighters were unable to mount a direct attack. Instead, they devised a containment strategy, utilising heavy plant to put in several containment lines and fallback lines. The fire was thus largely contained within a gorge within the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park for the days that followed. The evidence in the brief establishes that many locals continued on with day-to-day life without planning to evacuate at this stage, even though aware of the presence of fire in a national park. That is, the fire wasn't immediately threatening properties. According to a statement from Mr. David Beaumar, on 6 November 2019, there were fires all around, but nothing looked too close to the Blomfield Road properties because the fire was on the other side of the gorge. On 7 November 2019, though, the Stockyard Creek fire breached a containment on the Yarrabindi Trail under very high winds and made a significant 6-kilometre run to the east-southeast, merging with the Doyles River fire to the east. This is displayed in the fire progression mapping from page 66, now showing on the screen, which has the Stockyard Creek fire reaching the Doyles River fire and merging with it. Wind gusts are reported to have reached up to 100 kilometres an hour during the day. The combined fire, so Stockyard Creek and Doyles River, spread 15.5 kilometres that day, an extreme and anomalous rate of spread. Spot fires were recorded up to 14 kilometres ahead of the fire front. Tragically, Mr. Bratby fell within the path of the Stockyard Creek fire at his property in Yarrowitch this day and sustained his ultimately fatal injuries. Despite RFS aircraft deploying to protect property and assets, 18 properties on and around Blomfield Road were destroyed, including 6 properties on the nearby Kangaroo Flat Road. On 8 November 2019, the Stockyard Creek fire spread a further 35.8 kilometres east-southeast, meaning the amalgamated Stockyard Creek fire had collectively spread around 50 kilometres in 2 consecutive days. This is evident in the fire progression mapping from page 79 of the brief that is now displayed on the screen in court. This was again described in a fire progression report as highly extreme and anomalous fire behaviour. On 11 November 2019, the Stockyard Creek fire merged with the larger Carra Creek fire to its north, and this is displayed in the fire progression mapping from page 94 of the brief. The Carra Creek fire marked in the olive colours and the Stockyard Flat fire marked in the brown towards the bottom of that map. On this day, the Stockyard Creek fire was authorised as out, amalgamated on the RFS icon system. But what that meant, Your Honour, is that it actually was amalgamated into the larger fire, which continued to burn. The Carra Creek fire itself, in fact, continued to burn until January of 2020. In the approximate 2-week period during which the Stockyard Creek fire burned before it was amalgamated with the Carra Creek fire, it destroyed around 70,000 hectares of land, comprising 30,000 hectares of national park, 18,000 hectares of state forest, and 23,000 hectares of private land and farmland. It destroyed an estimated 22 residential buildings and 22 outbuildings, as well as livestock, including cattle and goats. In addition to the injuries that Mr. Bratby sustained and that would lead to his death, a resident of Abermain was injured and hospitalised, and a firefighter was reportedly injured on duty at a property in Yarrowitch and received hospital treatment. Key conclusions as to cause and origin. Senior Constable Michael McDonnell was the officer in charge of the Stockyard Flat Fire inquiry and the inquest into the death of Russell Bratby. When asked about the delay between the time of the lightning strike being recorded and the time the fire was first reported to the RFS, Senior Constable McDonnell said he was not surprised by the delay. He emphasised that the small population in the area and the dense gorges and valleys within the national park, where the fire originated, likely explained the delay. Detective Technical Inspector Michelle Hepburn was manager of the Crime Scene Services Branch Western Zone, which is part of the Forensic Evidence and Technical Services Command. She is also an authorised wildfire investigator. Inspector Hepburn undertook a cause and origin investigation for the Stockyard Flat Fire on 7 July 2020. A request for such a cause and origin investigation was not made until May of 2020, several months after the fire started. This delay was likely due to the sheer number of fires across the 2019-2020 season, the time taken to determine which of those fires should receive a cause and origin investigation, and the impact of the intervening COVID-19 pandemic and public health orders. Inspector Hepburn acknowledged that natural and human-related changes to the fire scene that occur over the space of time hampers any cause and origin investigation, and the investigation into the Stockyard Creek fire was no exception to this. Further, the terrain at the general area of origin made a detailed scene investigation impossible. When Inspector Hepburn attended the scene, she was accompanied by first responder James Goodwin from the RFS, as well as Cherie Lute, wife of the other first responder, Chris Lute. Ms Lute provided access to her property in Yarrowitch as an access point to the suspected fire origin in the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park. Assisted by Mr Goodwin, Inspector Hepburn drove as far as was safely possible on an access track and proceeded by foot to a steep cliff where she made observations of the point where Mr Goodwin said the fire had started. Like Mr Goodwin and Mr Lute on 27 October 2019, the terrain simply made it too unsafe for Inspector Hepburn to access the suspected area of origin for the Stockyard Flat Fire. Inspector Hepburn agreed that the inevitable vegetation regrowth since the fire would have inhibited her ability to identify the point of origin of the fire, even if she had been able to access the scene on foot. Nonetheless, in her statement, Inspector Hepburn was able to eliminate arson, vehicle fire, smoking, juvenile fire play, firearm use, power lines, hazard reduction, debris burning, ember attack, and campfire as potential causes due to the inaccessibility of the area by vehicle or foot, and the fact that there were no active fires in the immediate area, other active fire sources in the immediate area at the time that the fire was first sighted. Inspector Hepburn acknowledged that 4 simultaneous lightning strikes recorded on 26 October 2019 fell within the general vicinity of the area of origin. However, in the absence of a direct physical scene examination, she was not prepared to go so far as to conclude that lightning strike was the cause of the Stockyard Flat Fire. In particular, Inspector Hepburn could not rule out spontaneous combustion as a cause of the fire. She was, however, satisfied that human action did not cause the Stockyard Flat Fire. It is submitted that the Stockyard Flat Fire originated on 26 October 2019 within the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park to the western side of the Yarrowitch River within a very steep, inaccessible gorge. Notwithstanding the understandable caution expressed by Inspector Hepburn, it is submitted that Your Honour could find the cause of the fire was a lightning strike on 26 October 2019. In this regard, the Court is invited to weigh the presence of lightning in the general area of origin the day before the fire was first observed as pointing to lightning as the most likely cause of the fire on the balance of probabilities. Your Honour, those assisting the court express their sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to the court to assist with the coronial inquiry into the Stockyard flat fire, and extend their sincere condolences to the family of Russell Bratby.
Thank you, Ms Ford.
If it's convenient, I'll now move straight into the Bratby inquest, and at the conclusion of those submissions, Ms Woodland, who I think is the only appearance in these two matters, might advise the court whether she has any submissions.
Yes, thank you.
Mr Russell Bratby was 59 years old when he died in the early hours of 29 December 2019 at the Royal North Shore Hospital as a result of complications of the effects of fire. More particularly, on 7 November 2019, a fire known as the Stockyard Flat Fire impacted several properties along Blomfield Road, Yarrowitch, including a bush property that the Bratby family had owned for some years and used for camping holidays. So again, the extract from the Bratby brief at page 100 is displayed to show the various boundaries of the properties that existed along Blomfield Road, and also something of the vegetation and remoteness of the area. Mr Bratby had been staying at the family property that his family owned on Blomfield Road, Yarrowitch, at the time of the fire. The Yarrowitch property owned by Russell and Tracy Bratby included a couple of old caravans and cars and a dilapidated log cabin. The property had a couple of rainwater tanks, but no regular water supply. There was no reliable electricity supply nor mobile phone coverage. Mr Bratby had set up some type of battery power supply that he could sometimes rely upon when visiting the property so that he could charge his phone and remain in contact with his wife Tracy. Although he had not visited the block for some years, Mr Bratby travelled there in October 2019 to investigate reports that people had been trespassing on the property. Mr Bratby decided to go take a look and also took the opportunity to take up some roofing sheets with him for a shed that he was intending to build on the property. Mr Bratby borrowed a friend's vehicle to drive from the family home in Lake Macquarie to Yarrowitch. After experiencing some mechanical difficulties with the vehicle en route, Mr Bratby arrived at the property with his dog Khan on 25 October 2019. There were further mechanical problems with the vehicle even after reaching Yarrowitch, and Mr Bratby ultimately had to leave it in the nearby township of Walker for repairs. This meant he did not have his own independent means of transport to leave Yarrowitch until such time as the ute was back in working order and he had collected it from town. Meanwhile, on 27 October 2019, a fire was reported to the Rural Fire Service, burning in very steep terrain within the Yarrowitch Gorge to the northwest of Blomfield Road. In response to the report of fire, 2 RFS members, who I've just referred to in the closing submissions for the fire inquiry, Mr James Goodwin and Mr Chris Lute, went to Blomfield Road and a property that would give them a good vantage point to the fire burning to the northwest. At this time, Mr Goodwin and Mr Lute spoke to Mr Bratby about the fire across the gully and the dangers posed should the fire reach Mr Bratby's isolated property, which had restricted access and no fire preparation. They reported in statements to the court that Mr Bratby did not seem concerned and said he could get out down a track if the main road became blocked by fire. They, though, were concerned that neither the property nor Mr Bratby were prepared in the event fire reached Blomfield Road. This is not to suggest, though, that Mr Bratby actually planned to stay and defend the property from fire. Rather, based upon the things he said to his wife when he was able to speak to her by phone, Mr Bratby intended to remain in Yarrowitch whilst waiting for the vehicle he was using to be repaired, and then he was going to drive home. In the intervening days, the RFS were active along Blomfield Road, putting in some fire breaks on a property across from the Bratby property. Separate to the RFS activity, New South Wales Police attended the Bratby property on 30 October 2019 to talk to Mr Bratby in response to his complaint that some building material had gone missing from his block. So, Your Honour, various people were in contact with Mr Bratby even whilst he was stuck out at the property without a working motor vehicle. Mr Bratby expected to return home on 6 November 2019 and planned on firstly getting a lift into Walker with his friend and neighbour Mr David Bomer to collect the ute. That plan did not come to fruition, and Mr Bratby told Mr Bomer the vehicle was not yet ready. As he had 3 days' worth of food and was content to stay out on the bush block, he told Mr Bomer he would be all right to wait until the vehicle was ready in town. Mr Bomer told Mr Bratby if he needed a lift into town, he should go up to the mailbox at the end of Blomfield Road and get a lift with the mail delivery on Friday. Alternately, he could speak to Alison, another neighbour on Blomfield Road. Mr Bomer says no one was then concerned about the fire burning across the gorge. But on the 7th of November 2019, the Stockyard Flat fire indeed reached Blomfield Road. Mr Bomer, who had returned to his home in Walker by this time, received a phone call from Alison out on Blomfield Road saying she was scared as the smoke was really thick and she was getting out. Alison told Mr Bomer that if Mr Bratby was still in Yarrowitch, he could use her ute, still parked at her property, to get out. Mr Bomer tried to get into contact with Mr Bratby, but was unable to speak to him because he didn't have the right phone number. Mr Bomer then sent a message to Mrs Bratby, who in turn attempted to contact her husband but couldn't get through. Page 74 from the Stockyard Flat fire brief will now be displayed. This is line scan mapping showing fire spread on the 7th of November 2019, being the date on which fire clearly impacted on Blomfield Road, sometime around late morning and into the late afternoon. A range of photos will now be shown from the inquest brief showing the after effects of fire along Blomfield Road. At around 1 p.m. on 7 November 2019, Simon Connerty, National Parks and Wildlife Service strike team leader, and his colleague Michael Jarman attended Blomfield Road. This was shortly after the fire had impacted the area. I'm not sure if we're able to flip that image, but it's taken from page 94 of the brief, and Your Honour will be able to see it in hard copy within that brief, just showing the reach of the smoke plume. It's a photo taken by someone, I think one of the first responders in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. On arrival at the property, Mr Connerty saw Mr Bratby walking towards him down the driveway from the Beaumar property. So this is the driveway on screen now, Your Honour, and you can see there's a slight rise from the roadway up towards the driveway where Mr Bratby was first seen. As he walked down that slope, his clothes were wet, and Mr Connerty could see he had significant full thickness burns. Upon entering the property, Mr Connerty observed a 5,000 litre polyethylene water tank partially melted and split open, apparently due to the heat of the fire. On Mr Bratby's account, When he knew the fire was approaching, he put the dog Khan into the caravan he had been camping out in, and then he walked to the Boma property to use that as a vantage point to see where the fire was. At some point he looked back and he realised the fire was threatening the caravan. So he ran back to let Khan out of the van, and then he raced back to the Boma property, running through flames along the way. He told his wife that he noticed the water tank and he thought it might provide shelter from the fire, although he didn't have a memory of what happened next or how long he was there before the rescuers found him. When his rescuers did in fact reach him, Mr. Bratby was in pain, but he was calm, and he informed Mr. Connerty that he had a sore chest and abdomen. The National Parks and Wildlife Service officers poured water over Mr. Bratby's burns and wrapped him in a fire blanket. Mr. Connerty requested a medevac helicopter evacuation for Mr. Bratby. At 4:11 p.m, New South Wales Ambulance received a 000 call from a member of the RFS reporting that Mr. Bratby had sustained significant burns to his arms and to his legs. An ambulance was assigned to respond, but the location was surrounded by active fire. This posed an obvious danger to anyone in the vicinity. In the meantime, the Rapid Launch Trauma Coordinator at the New South Wales Aeromedical Control Centre contacted the RFS to ask for patient information and to check whether there were any RFS aircraft in the area. Westpac 4 was the nearest aeromedical helicopter. It had recently left Newcastle on return to base in Tamworth. So Westpac 4, Your Honour, is a different helicopter to any RFS aircraft in the area. At 4:25 p.m, the Westpac 4 pilot accepted the job, but needed to firstly refuel at Cessnock before heading to Yarrowitch. At 4:51 p.m, a New South Wales Ambulance Special Operation Team, comprised of paramedics from the ambulance service who are specialised in providing urgent medical care in remote locations, were also tasked to attend. An RFS helicopter was available to transport the Special Operations Team and left Armidale Airport for Yarrowitch. The RFS helicopter was at first unable to land at Blomfield Road because of debris and smoke. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service and RFS crews on the ground cleared trees and watered down an area to try and create a safe landing site for the helicopter. The Special Operation Team then arrived on scene via RFS helicopter at some time after 6 p.m, and commenced their treatment of Mr. Bratby. A short time later, a road ambulance was able to reach the scene, and Mr. Bratby was transferred onto a stretcher and placed into the road ambulance, pending the arrival of the Westpac 4 chopper. At 6:25 p.m, Westpac 4 arrived but was unable to land. It is a larger chopper than the RFS helicopter that was first on scene. A critical care physician and a specialist paramedic on board Westpac 4 were instead winched down from the helicopter to render assistance. At 6:50 p.m, Mr. Bratby was winched into the Westpac 4 helicopter and transported to Port Macquarie Airport, where he was met by another road ambulance. This ambulance then transferred him by road to the emergency department at the Port Macquarie Hospital. He arrived there at around 8:15 p.m. Mr. Bratby was treated at Port Macquarie Hospital for about 8 hours. Port Macquarie Hospital conferred with specialists at the Royal North Shore Hospital in order to stabilise Mr. Bratby's burn injuries and prepare him for transfer to Royal North Shore. So, in the early hours of the following morning, 8 November 2019, Mr. Bratby was transferred by air to the intensive care unit for specialist burns at Royal North Shore. He was observed to have 23% total body surface area burns, predominantly on the upper and lower limbs and the face. Your Honour, this explains the complex chronology and the many documents within the brief provided by the ambulance service, because there were so many different ambulance appliances involved in Mr. Bratby's care. During the initial period of his treatment at Port Macquarie Hospital and his admission at Royal North Shore, Mr. Bratby was conscious and communicative. He was able to talk to his loved ones and provide some details about the fire, although he could not recall specific events around the time the fire impacted and the time he spent at the water tank. He ultimately underwent several debridement and grafting procedures to treat his burn injuries. Sadly, Mr. Bratby's condition deteriorated during his admission at Royal North Shore, and he needed to be intubated to protect his airways after coughing up blood. Over the ensuing weeks, he developed multiple serious complications. These included acute renal failure, progressing to chronic liver failure, low blood protein, a blood infection for which his injured skin was the likely source, increased bile in the blood, and ultimately ventilator-associated pneumonia. Mr. Bratby was diagnosed with hemolysis due to oxidative stress from arsenic toxicity, which may have arisen due to toxic gas inhalation from the material used to manufacture the water tank where Mr. Bratby sought refuge. Mr. Bratby's neurological condition deteriorated and an MRI was taken on 22 November 2019, which showed extensive necrosis of white matter in the brain. On 20 December 2019, a senior medical officer noted that Mr. Bratby was in a severe vegetative state, which had not improved in the last 6 weeks, and he was dialysis dependent with large areas of burns. The senior medical officer concluded, "Given all this, I feel the chance of Mr. Bratby making a good functional recovery is slim." After discussions with his family, it was decided that Mr. Bratby should be treated as not for resuscitation, and he was eventually transferred to palliative care. After some 7 weeks of hospital admission, Mr. Bratby was pronounced deceased at 2:09 a.m. on 29 December 2019. Moving then to evidence received during the inquest. The court has received into evidence a volume of material comprising 275 pages, which includes a recorded interview with members of Mr. Bratby's family, statements from New South Wales Police, New South Wales Ambulance, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, RFS, and many civilian witness statements. It also includes expert evidence from a forensic pharmacologist, toxicologist, and an intensive care expert. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person is required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, and the manner and cause of their death. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future, arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, Mr. Bratby's identity is known, as is the date and place of his death. For this reason, the inquest into Mr. Bratby's death focused on manner and cause. Expert evidence and key conclusions. Xuan Fung, surname Fu, a forensic pharmacologist, toxicologist from the New South Wales Police Force Pharmacology Services Unit, was engaged to provide an opinion on the chemical compounds contained within a polyethylene water tank and the likely effects of certain gases and fumes upon the human body if released from such a tank. Dr. Fu informed the court that carbon monoxide is the most common toxic gas released from the combustion of polyethylene, and so the signs displayed by Mr. Bratby that is, no memory or no precise memory of what had happened at time of fire impact, nor any precise memory of how long he had been in the vicinity of the water tank, may have been consistent with carbon monoxide poisoning. In Dr. Wu's expert opinion, Mr. Bratby may have inhaled a mixture of polyethylene combustion components at a toxic quantity, in addition to possible PVC combustion components, which may have caused significant harm to his body. Professor Ian Seppold, intensive care expert at the Department of Intensive Care Medicine, Nepean Hospital, was engaged to review the entirety of Mr. Bratby's medical records from his treatment at both Port Macquarie Hospital and the Royal North Shore Hospital. In Professor Seppold's view, Mr. Bratby was treated appropriately for his burn injury, his acute kidney failure, and for the various complications he suffered, including those he developed whilst in hospital. Professor Seppold was satisfied that Mr. Bratby's neurological deterioration was investigated and treated appropriately, and that he was appropriately transitioned to palliative care once it became clear that he had minimal chance of a meaningful neurological recovery, in conjunction with other complications including ongoing renal failure secondary to burn injury. Professor Seppold identified one red flag from his review of the medical records in relation to the treatment of Mr. Bratby at the emergency department at Port Macquarie Hospital. A blood gas specimen showed a metabolic acidosis and evidence of a significant inhalation injury. In his opinion, there was no evidence from the records that a subsequent arterial blood gas specimen was taken soon after an arterial line was inserted. Professor Seppold was not convinced that staff understood the significance of the results of the venous blood gas, which showed significant carbon monoxide exposure and which, in his view, necessitated the administration of high-flow normobaric oxygen via a tight-fitting face mask, continuing until Mr. Bratby reached Sydney. Professor Seppold acknowledged, however, that the inhalation injury occurred almost 8 hours prior to Mr. Bratby's attendance at Port Macquarie Hospital, and that staff were understandably focused on stabilising Mr. Bratby for transfer to Sydney. He informed the court, furthermore, that treatment for carbon monoxide poisoning is controversial, and even if high-flow normobaric oxygen had been available, it may not have altered the outcome for Mr. Bratby. Professor Seppold did not identify any matters raising systemic issues which would warrant recommendations. In summary, while he identified one red flag, Professor Seppold was satisfied that Mr. Bratby was treated appropriately by the New South Wales Ambulance, the Port Macquarie Hospital and the Royal North Shore Hospital. Given the extraordinary nature of Mr. Bratby's injuries and the way in which Professor Seppold emphasised that the hospital response needed to be considered in this context, the court determined that it was not necessary to further investigate the one red flag raised by the expert. It is submitted that upon making formal findings recording the manner and cause of Mr. Bratby's death, the court's findings and the expert report of Professor Seppold should be referred to Port Macquarie Hospital for further consideration, so that a copy of the report travels to them for review. However, no recommendations are warranted. Manner and cause of death. The pathologist at autopsy concluded that Mr. Bratby's cause of death was best described as complications of the effects of fire. It is submitted that this should be recorded as cause of death because it is both broad enough to encapsulate both the complications arising from the burns Mr. Bratby sustained and the complications arising from the inhalation of noxious fumes on 7 November 2019 in connection with the Stockyard Flat fire. Your Honour, those assisting the court express thanks to Mr. Bratby's wife Tracy for her willingness to participate in and assist with this coronial investigation into the death of her husband. The council assisting team again express condolences to the extended Bratby family and to Mr Bratby's friends, and most particularly to Tracy, Shauna and Murray for the loss of their beloved husband and father.
Thank you, Ms Ward. And I too would like to express my condolences to Mr Bratby's family.
Now, I'm not sure if Ms Woodland, I don't expect that the RFS have any submissions to make, but I should just check with Ms Woodland.
Ms Woodland? No.
No submissions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Mr Castleton?
No, please, Your Honour. If it's convenient, Your Honour, I'd like to address Your Honour now in relation to the Palmer's Oakey Upper Turon fire. Your Honour, that fire burned for approximately 58 days and burnt an area of approximately 17,414 hectares, encompassing the lands of the Wiradjuri people in the Lithgow and Mid-Western local government areas. This inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin. Your Honour, there is no doubt from evidence adduced during the inquiry that the fire originated near the boundary of a property known as Eldrickham Springs at 1620 Upper Turon Road, Upper Turon, and the adjacent property to the north, Bingletree, at 1616 Upper Turon Road, Upper Turon. Nor is there, Your Honour, any doubt that a spark or sparks from a welder being used to erect a fence on Eldrickham Springs on the morning of 4 December 2019 led to the ignition of the fire. This fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. As Your Honour knows, not all fires were reported to Your Honour. Not all fires reported to Your Honour proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is respectfully submitted that it is not necessary for the Palmer's Oakey fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Coming, if I may, to the chronology of events. The Palmer's Oakey Upper Turon fire ignited at about 11:30 a.m. on 4 December 2019. At that time, Jamie Edwards and Mark Turner were carrying out fencing work at the boundary of Eldrickham Springs and Bingletree. I'll just have displayed now, Your Honour, a map marked by Jamie Edwards, which marks the location of the work, that is the fencing work, they were carrying out on the morning of 4 December 2019. Mr Edwards had been hired to erect a series of fences on Eldrickham Springs. Mr Turner was retained by Mr Edwards. Both gave evidence about the start of the fire. The fencing work involved the use of a welder. Strainer and star picket posts were inserted into the ground, pegged down with stays running diagonally between the strainer and the nearest star picket post. The stays were welded near the top of the strainer post using a stick welder. It was Mr Turner's first day on the job. He was asked by Mr Edwards to weld. Eager to impress his new boss and secure further work, Mr Turner agreed to operate the welder. He had welded before in Western Australia. That welding was done in a shed and not so much in the field. Mr Edwards tasked Mr Turner with welding a stay to a strainer post in the field where a new fence intersected perpendicularly with the boundary fence separating Eldrickham Springs and Bingletree. And Your Honour, a photograph will be displayed now which shows that area where the fencing work was to take place. Metres to the west was the Tobin's Oakey Trail. About 50 metres to the east was a dry creek bed known as Tobin's Oakey Creek. At the time, Mr Edwards was aware of the risk of fire. He knew that the property, like the surrounding area, was affected by drought. The conditions were hot and dry. Whilst Mr Turner was welding, Mr Edwards was acting as a spotter. His task was to identify and put out any ignition caused by the welder. Mr. Edwards had no firefighting equipment with him. Before the start of the weld, he did not arrange to wet down the area around the strainer post, put down a tarpaulin, clear an area around the post, ensure a fire extinguisher was present, or ensure that he had with him a spray pack or other firefighting unit. There was only one operational firefighting unit on Eldrecamp Springs that day. The evidence of the owner, Mr. Charbel Tanous, was that there was a 1,000 litre pod on a trailer on the property. The trailer was defective and could not be moved. The jockey wheel was broken. That left a weed sprayer in the tray of a ute as the one operational firefighting unit on the property. And Your Honour will see a photograph of that particular unit now. Your Honour, Spencer Morgan, an employee of the owners of Eldrecamp Springs, gave evidence that on the morning of 4 December, he had the weed sprayer on a paddock that he was ploughing using a bulldozer. The paddock was over a rise about 500 metres away from the fencing work being carried out by Mr. Edwards. There was no line of sight to that work. Mr. Edwards claims that the unit was significantly closer, although this begs the question why Mr. Edwards needed to drive to Mr. Morgan to secure the use of the weed sprayer after the start of the fire. The evidence differs as to who first spotted the fire. Mr. Turner gave evidence that he smelt burning whilst welding a stay to the strainer post that intersected the northern boundary fence. He looked up and saw a fire in the serrated tussock on the opposite side of the boundary fence on Bingletree. Mr. Turner jumped the fence with Mr. Edwards and began putting out the fire with their boots. Although Mr. Edwards was acting as a spotter, he did not alert Mr. Turner to the fire. Mr. Edwards' evidence was that at around 11:30 a.m, he saw the welder arc and drop bits of hot metal. The metal hit dry serrated tussock on the other side of the existing fence and the fire ignited. Mr. Edwards says he then pulled up Mr. Turner and they both jumped over the fence to try and put out the fire. Regardless of who saw the fire first, both Mr. Turner and Mr. Edwards gave evidence that serrated tussock ignited on the opposite side of the boundary fence to where Mr. Turner was welding. Mr. Turner said it was not even a metre away. Mr. Edwards marked the point of ignition as on the Bingletree side of the fence, at the bottom of the strainer post. Both candidly gave evidence that the fire was started from sparks from the welder. Shortly after the start of the fire, Mr. Edwards drove his Toyota Hilux to alert Mr. Morgan of the fire. Mr. Morgan's evidence was that after driving to the fire with the weed sprayer, he saw another individual, likely Mr. Turner, trying to put out with a shovel a regular little grass fire. It had just gotten a little out of control. The fire was about 30 metres square in size. Mr. Turner said it seemed like it had started somewhere towards the front gate. There was a gate a mere metres to the west, that is the left, of the strainer post that Mr. Turner was welding. Neither Mr. Edwards, Mr. Turner, nor Mr. Morgan knew how to properly operate the weed sprayer. They could not operate the pressure valve, which resulted in less than optimal water flow and pressure. None of them had previously been shown by the owners of Eldrecamp Springs how to operate the pressure valve. Their evidence is that they could not extinguish the fire and it continued to spread. Your Honour, the path of the fire is evident in this photograph taken in the days after ignition. At 12:06 p.m, after a period of at least half an hour from the start of the fire, Mr. Edwards attempted to contact one of the owners of Eldrecamp Springs, Chabelle Tannous. At 12:24 p.m, Mr Tannous telephoned 000 and reported the fire to Fire and Rescue New South Wales. A further 000 call was made by Mr Turner at 12:31 p.m. Coming now to the observations of New South Wales Rural Fire Service personnel. James Ferguson and Captain Michael Grabham were two of the first members of the Rural Fire Service to arrive at Eldrecamp Springs on the 4th of December 2019. Both gave evidence about the origin of the fire consistent with Messrs Edwards, Turner and Morgan. Mr Ferguson arrived at the site of the fire at about 1:15 p.m. He saw that the vegetation had all burnt out heading from the boundary fence that separated Eldrecamp Springs from Bingle Tree. The fire had progressed about 300 metres easterly up a hill on the opposite side of the creek. Mr Ferguson proceeded to fight the fire using a weed sprayer on the back of his ute. About 15 minutes later, Captain Grabham arrived on the first official RFS appliance to reach the site. He identified from the wind direction and the path of the fire that the fire had ignited near the fence line adjacent to Tobin's Oakey Trail. He saw 3 individuals working on a fence and asked them where and how the fire started. Those individuals pointed to the general location that Captain Grabham had identified on arrival at the northern boundary fence adjacent to Tobin's Oakey Trail. Captain Grabham, Your Honour, marked on this satellite image the location with a red circle. Your Honour, that marking corresponds with the location where Mr Edwards and Mr Turner were welding. The following day, that is the 5th of December, Captain Grabham attended the area that he had identified as the likely point of origin. He, and I quote, deduced that the fire had started around where the fencing works had been undertaken, specifically a strainer post right on the boundary where the new fence was coming off. End quotes. These views on the point of origin are consistent with photographs taken by Group Captain Brendan Cole of the juncture between the boundary fence and the new fence in the days after ignition. And Your Honour sees those photographs now on screen. As Your Honour has seen, the photographs show a concentration of burnt tussock from the strainer post to the north of the boundary fence. Almost no fire damage is evident to the south. Your Honour, over the following 8 weeks, the fire spread from Eldrecamp Springs to Bingle Tree and beyond to encompass about 17,414 hectares until it was officially declared out on the 31st of January 2020. As Your Honour sees on screen now, the final fire progression map. Your Honour can see that the Palmer's Oakey fire can be seen west of the Gospers Mountain fire. Your Honour, the damage caused by the fire was surveyed by New South Wales Police. It was recorded that 10 homes were destroyed, along with 14 outbuildings, and a further 2 homes and 4 outbuildings were damaged. Coming now, Your Honour, to the evidence received as part of Your Honour's inquiry. Your Honour has received into evidence 4 volumes of material which include statements from members of New South Wales Police and RFS, fire investigation reports, RFS documents, lightning strike data and Bureau of Meteorology weather data, police transcripts of records of interview with Mr Edwards and Mr Turner, and several witness statements from those present on the day or who assisted with efforts to fight the fire in its early stages. Detective Acting Inspector Glenn Griffith, New South Wales Police Officer in charge of the investigation, and Shane Bryant, Deputy Captain and authorised fire investigator with the RFS, each gave oral evidence on the 21st of June this year. Spencer Morgan, Mark Turner, Jamie Edwards and Chabelle Ternous each gave oral evidence the following day, the 22nd of June 2022. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquiry concerning a fire is required to make findings as to the date and place of the fire and the circumstances of that particular fire. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to any matter connected with a fire inquiry. In this inquiry, the focus was on identifying where and when the Palmer's Oakey fire originated and the circumstances of same, including the cause. Turning now to key conclusions. The evidence of fire investigators from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service and New South Wales Police aligns with the eyewitness accounts provided in relation to the cause and origin. RFS fire investigator Shane Bryant attended Eldrickham Springs on the 21st of January 2020. He examined the ignition site and saw a newly installed fence post on the northern boundary with signs of welding. He identified the area of origin as the base of that post. Mr. Bryant did this by walking from Toby's Oakey Creek to the west, using a serpentine pattern to track the movement of the fire. He identified the angle of char on serrated tussock north of the boundary fence that showed the fire moving in a north-easterly direction from the fence line. Mr. Bryant concluded that the area of origin was the fence post at latitude and longitude 33 degrees, 8 minutes 15 seconds south, 149 degrees 48 minutes 43 seconds east, located along Tobin Oakey Trail between 1616 and 1620 Upper Turon Road. Mr. Bryant identified no other potential causes of the fire other than sparks from a welder or grinder. The wide pattern of the fire near the fence line was, in his opinion, consistent with broad spatter of a pipe which would be produced by a welder on a galvanised pipe. That opinion was shared by Detective Sergeant Buning, who carried out an inspection on 9 January 2020, but was not available to give evidence. Detective Sergeant Buning identified signs of welding where two poles met on the northern boundary, and I'll have those photographs shown now, Your Honour. And angle of char on serrated tussocks to the north and east of the strainer post, which indicated that the fire moved in a northerly direction away from the fence line. Coming now to address Your Honour on cause and origin of the fire. The frank admissions of those involved in the welding, namely Mr. Edwards and Mr. Turner, the evidence of Mr. Morgan, RFS personnel and the expert fire investigators all points to a single cause and point of origin of the Palmer's Oakey fire. The origin of the fire on the 4th of December 2019 was at the base of the strainer post at latitude 33 degrees, 8 minutes 15 seconds south and longitude 149 degrees, 48 minutes 43 seconds east on the property known as Bingle Tree at 1616 Upper Turon Road, Upper Turon. The cause of the Palmer's Oakey fire on the 4th of December 2019 was, we submit, due to an accidental ignition caused by a spark or sparks from welding equipment being used to weld together a new metal strainer fence post to a new metal stay post operated by Mark Turner under the direction of Mr. Jamie Edwards on the adjoining property at Eldrickham Springs, 1620 Upper Turon Road, Upper Turon. May it please Your Honour, that concludes Councillor Sisting's closing address in relation to that fire inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton.
Unless Ms. Ransom wishes to address Your Honour on anything, that concludes this morning's proceedings.
Ms. Ransom?
No further questions.
Thank you. Well, we'll adjourn today and resume on Monday the 19th of September at 12 noon.
My pleasure, Honour.
Right.